Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning, good morning. I know it's very difficult to be awake in Canberra at 7:30. Those of you from across our great continent, some of you it's 4:30 in the morning, some of you at 7 o'clock, and other time zones I don't know. And I still don't understand why Queenslanders don't have daylight saving. So I'm not apologetic for you guys because you have sunshine all the time. So as a Melburnian, that really offends me. My name is Luke Sheehy. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Univeristies Australia. Can I acknowledge we're on the lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to elders past and present and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders with us today. I'm really excited that we're going to get cracking on this conversation. You're going to hear so much from me over the next couple of days, which I'm already bored by myself. So I'm delighted my counterparts from across the world are joining me for this discussion. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce Gabriel Miller, who is President and CEO of Univeristies Canada. Online is Vivienne Stern, MBE, CEO of Univeristies UK. It's a lovely at 8:30 in the evening. Thank you for joining us, Vivienne, from the UK. And of course, one of our own Vice-Chancellors, Professor Andrew Deeks, who's not only Vice-Chancellor at Murdoch University in the great state of Western Australia, but also President of the International Association of Universities. So this is a fireside chat. Feel free to go and get more coffee. I know some of you hit it hard last night at our welcome drinks. I could see that was all going on, and all those weird secret dinners that I wasn't invited to, but that's fine. I'm okay. I entertain the Vice-Chancellors with aplomb. So looking forward to this chat. A really interesting time in global perspectives, both in terms of what's happening in our sister countries in the Anglosphere, but also bringing in Andy for a perspective on the broader university context around the world. So welcome to everyone today. So let's get started. I think it's been really interesting for us in Australia talking about social licence in the last couple of years, but particularly in the last couple of months. We've had a really interesting and intense time in Australia. Andy, is this the case around the world? Are universities struggling to get buy-in with governments and their people in all contexts, or is this just something that we're struggling with in the English-speaking world?
Well, I think it's probably a little beyond the English-speaking world, but it's clearly a phenomenon in Western democracies. We don't see that so much in members in countries which are in the global East or the global South. And indeed, when we had our international conference in Tokyo in November last year, our Japanese colleagues were amazed at some of the things we were saying about this loss of social license, because within Japan and indeed within many of the Eastern countries, there is no loss of trust in institutions. The universities are still highly respected, and indeed within the broader global South, there is a desperate desire to get into universities, to get a university degree, with all the social mobility that implies. So I think sometimes there's a danger when we're only talking in forums like this one, talking with other people from Western democracies, that we assume that what happens in Western democracies is at the same time happening around the world. So the talk of deglobalization, actually that is constrained to Western democracies, whereas much of the rest of the world is still full speed ahead in terms of globalization.
I'm going to go to you, Vivienne. I came and saw you in London a week before your general election in the last week of June last year. There was excitement that you were going to get maybe some more stable and rational thinking around the university sector and your importance to the UK economy and, of course, UK's connection with the rest of the world. And how's social licence and universities going for you a year in, nearly, to the Starmer administration? Oh, we're just waiting for some sound. Of course, in 2025. We'll keep trying.
I can hear you fine.
We've got you now. Go ahead.
Okay, brilliant. Well, look, I think in terms of the kind of government attitude, definitely there's been a change of tone. The Labour government was elected with several kind of prominent cabinet ministers saying the war on universities is over. We've had a much more supportive rhetoric from various government departments. But I don't think the underlying challenge that we face with ebbing trust and confidence in the university sector has by no means gone away. And I think that when you look at, it's interesting what Professor Deeks was saying about the, where this is a feature in where it isn't. I think if you look at other advanced economies like the UK, where you've got massive education systems funded by relatively high fees and a political swing, a kind of increasing pressure from the right wing, which has probably got very, very deep roots in all sorts of social and economic factors. I think we'd be pretty daft if we thought, right, job's done, we can stop worrying about it. Because if it doesn't re-emerge in British politics at the government level, it's certainly there amongst our opposition parties in the commentariat. And, you only have to look at our polls to think that it's quite possible that within 5 years we'll have a much more right-wing government.
And of course, well, thank you. We're a little jealous of lots of ministers of yours coming out in support of your university sector so unequivocally, but enjoy it while it lasts, I say. But certainly, look, Gabriel, all eyes are on North America at the moment. There's a great disruption south of your border, and what does that mean for your part of the world? And is that permeating into the Canadian kind of political context?
Yeah, no, it's been so all-consuming. I mean, how far do we want to go back? I mean, certainly for the last 2 months, that it's interesting to be asked, how much it's hitting us. Let me just say, first of all, how thrilled I am to be here. And Luke, thank you for the invitation. 50 centimeters of snow fell on my driveway before I came, and I got to wave at my neighbor who was shoveling it for me. So that right there is a huge thrill. And of course, no one's threatened me with tariffs since I got to Australia, which is refreshing. I think it's really been interesting in the last 2 months. And we were at a conference in Singapore a few days before this, promoting Canada's ties to countries in Asia. And yesterday I met with the High Commissioner for Canada here in Australia. And what I said in both of those meetings is I've never been prouder to be a Canadian than I have in the last 2 months. And that's because Canada does its best when something from outside of Canada threatens it. Now, the problem is, it turns out we're at our best when the world's in the most danger. And we don't want it to work that way. But I think that, in a way, it's been clarifying. Because, first of all, it's allowed us, I think, to start moving into a bigger conversation about the future of the country and our economy that actually isn't quite as inward-looking and focused just on the sector. There's not space for any other conversation in Canada as long as there's a threat that the United States will impose 25% tariffs. So we could just forget about going in and talking to people about funding universities if we're looking at a 2 or 3 point decline in economic growth, mass unemployment. So it's really focused the mind. I think it's also put into perspective the discussions around universities a bit more. And the way I've been thinking about this increasingly is that the real axis in our politics now, domestically and globally, is between builders and breakers. And builders are people who believe in institutions fundamentally, see their flaws, and want to work on reforming them. And breakers are, I don't like this, therefore it is corrupt to the core, and we're going to wipe it off the face of the earth. And that, I think, has become the fundamental kind of debate and divide in our society. And universities, to me, have to be very firmly on the side of builders. And I think now we have an opportunity to make that case in a way that, at least outside of the United States right now, that a lot of people are interested in making.
Yeah, it's something that we're thinking about a lot, is making the case, with this global decline in trust in institutions and organisations and the rise of, new types of political phenomenon, is how do we tap into an aspiration for our nations to be seen as those builders. It's a really great point. And we have such an important role to play. as in Australia, public institutions, right? We're not here for profit. Sometimes our friends in the commentariat would remind us that. Andrew, international world, we're seeing universities as an investment in often countries' economic development, economic and social development. Sometimes, if you think about the Australian context, we're seen as important, but not important enough to invest in, right? And I'll come to my colleagues from the UK and Canada on this around the domestic funding arrangements. But what are you seeing across the world around what governments are doing and nations are doing to invest in their own capability? I've often used the example of places like South Korea, Malaysia and others that have turbocharged their economies through becoming R&D intensive and skills intensive. Is that happening across the global south?
It's happening across the developing world. And with all of the drawbacks of university rankings, what we see in countries that don't have universities in the top 50, top 100, those governments are desperate to have universities in the top rankings. And they're investing in the universities, they're investing in research and development. And when one looks at the research productivity of the Western democracies, it has stagnated to an extent. The number of research papers, the number of PhDs being produced basically has stagnated now. But when you look at the developing world, that is accelerating at a rate of knots. When you look at what's coming out of China, the research publications, PhDs, that is accelerating dramatically. And something that's contributing now to that acceleration is the artificial intelligence tools, which are allowing people who work in languages other than English to be able to present their research in papers that have the right English, that describe things in the right way, that previously those papers were being rejected because the reviewers didn't understand the scientific content because it was disguised in the lack of skill with English. Now the AI tools are allowing people to overcome that. So we're seeing this acceleration in terms of research productivity in the rest of the world. So the valuing by those governments of their universities and of their research systems is impacting on that. The tools that are available is impacting on that. Within the Western democracies, we're so focused on these other issues now that governments are distracted from this productivity.
Yes, Vivienne, we talked last time we met for our fireside chat, which was in the middle of a London summer day, which was actually quite hot, so a bit like us today here in 33-degree Canberra, about potential funding decline. We battle in particularly Australia and UK to make the case for more investment in universities, and we've been very successful, I think, particularly UK, Canada and Australia, New Zealand as well, around topping up that lack of government support for our sector through international education. How hard is the challenge to make the case for governments to invest in its university system in the UK? And what are you finding with the Starmer administration? Is there an appetite for it, or as we've discovered here, there's a lot of talk, and we're waiting for a lot more action?
Yeah, I think if you take a sort of very, if you take a short-term view, I don't think the picture's particularly optimistic. We're about to head into a big spending review, which will be zero-based, and I think the government's under enormous pressure in budget terms, which has got, by the way, I think a lot worse in the last couple of weeks, with fairly negative economic forecasts and I think a growing understanding that our investment in defence needs to grow. So I don't feel terribly optimistic looking at the spend review that despite the fact that I think across government there's a widespread acknowledgement that the university system and the research system is under enormous financial pressure. I think that, even if the willingness is there, I think the room for manoeuvre is very limited. So I don't feel terribly optimistic. We've had some positive signals. Our government bit the bullet and increased the domestic tuition fee in England in line with inflation in October. I'm reasonably optimistic they'll allow it to rise in line with inflation over the course of the next few years. we've got a devolved higher education system in the UK, and in Wales there's been a recent very small increase in capital expenditure. There have been sort of marginal decisions, but I think in all four nations of the UK, budgets are really constrained. And frankly, there are bigger priorities, and that's what we're up against. So it's not that the willingness isn't there, but I think that we're just, we're very, very far from the top of the priority list. Having said that, I think if you take a longer term view, I would argue that there's been a reasonable political consensus across the last 2 decades that an advanced economy of the kind that the UK is has to try to remain competitive in sort of knowledge-intensive industries, that it has to be innovative, that it has to be able to retain its sort of position at the forefront of research. And so even through periods like the global financial crash and the sort of period of austerity in British policy following that, governments found ways to increase investment in both research and education. So I feel that there's a sort of an underlying understanding that there is a sort of medium to long-term existential, I think, threat for advanced economies like ours. That you can see the scale and speed of investment in other advanced economies. China's been mentioned, other parts of Asia rising very, very rapidly up the ranks in terms of volume and quality of research output. I think that it's widely understood we have to compete. But, like I say, the next spending review isn't going to be pretty. And we've got a real financial, I'm not going to call it a crisis because I think it's probably not helpful to dramatise these things, but there is enormous financial pressure on universities in the UK at the moment.
Yes, we do recall with, we were, I think, quite envious of the fact that even your previous Conservative governments kept R&D expenditure going in times of economic crisis, and it's something that our previous governments, we tried to cajole their Conservative leanings to copy their Conservative cousins in the UK, but to not much success. Gabriel, you've got the interesting situation where you've got a provincial-based system for funding. That's interesting to this audience. We've been had one tier of government funding since 1964. How does that play out for your members and your system when you've got a differentiated approach from different provinces of Canada? And do they differentiate? Do you have a have and have-nots approach in your country?
Yes, we definitely do. Although it's interesting, the have and have-nots sort of financially and economically across the country doesn't map on perfectly to have and have-nots institutionally. The great Canadian bargain that holds our country together is that we delegate a lot of power to provincial governments, and that allows for flexibility and for them to remain part of the federation. The cost of that is endless confusion and a lack of coordination between federal and provincial policies, which makes, you can imagine, I guess if you're working with a federal government who's not especially sympathetic, it might be nice to dream about being able to go and deal with a province, but it presents all sorts of challenges. The situation in Canada is the federal government's primary roles in supporting higher education are funding research and innovation. The federal government is by far the biggest funder of research in universities in the country. And now, as everyone's realized, especially in the last few years, as the level of government that holds the lever for how many international students can come into the country, and that has become enormously important to the sustainability of the sector. The only growth revenue in Canadian universities for the last 15 years has been international student fees. Government investments in domestic tuition have really fallen behind in real terms. What we've seen basically across the country at the provincial level is a kind of fantasy. And the fantasy is we can have more costs, we can have more people, and we can keep the amount that we spend the same. And the way we filled that gap in the last 10 years was by recruiting international students, which have actually brought all sorts of other benefits to the country. But when the government went into a crisis about housing prices and immigration levels, that contracted. I know none of this will sound familiar to you. I can explain the ins and outs of international student politics to you. I understand Australia hasn't grappled with any of that. And so we're really at a point where you need a much more coordinated and long-term approach to this, because there's a certain amount of kind of sliding the accountability between the two levels of government, and we're now at a point where that continues. Our universities are going to fall deeper into financial crisis.
Yeah, it's this idea that we extraordinarily for 4 decades in Australia were encouraged to find our own luck through international students, and it's a great success for our country, it's a great success for Canada and the UK and New Zealand and many other places. But then suddenly it becomes a political issue, right,
Yes.
which is discovered. I sat on this breakfast stage a year ago with the head of IDP Australia, Tennealle O'Shaughnessy, and we gleefully said we had become the most sought-after destination, and we were seen as more welcoming than Canada for the first time ever. That was February. By March, we'd worked out that this thing called Ministerial Direction 107 was a complete something or other, which I won't say for a breakfast audience. We were so arrogant to think that the Canadian disease wouldn't catch on.
Yes.
How has that played out? We want to know, because we caught it. We didn't quite do it as the same way as you, but for the benefit of our audience and for collective therapy on this stage, how has CAPS gone, and what's the future scenario now for Canada?
Well, first of all, for a country that's obsessed with diversifying our exports, I'm very pleased to know that the Canadian disease has now arrived here in Australia. That's great. I'm not sure that's the branding we're going for, but I'll take the message back to the diplomatic corps. It's been disastrous. I mean, mostly my career's been spent doing national advocacy for different types of national organizations. I've never seen a more chaotic, panicked, blunt, I have to be careful about how far I go in saying this, but ham-fisted response to a challenge as we've seen here. Basically, I started my job a little bit, almost a year ago, and so the explosion had happened before I started, but suddenly everybody in Canada in government realized that our housing prices had gotten quite high, and that there was a correlation, or at least politically there was a correlation between that and immigration numbers. So in January, they announced a 35% reduction in the number of students, international students, who'd be admitted to the country, a cap. And then in September, they announced a further 10% reduction. But what we realized as we headed into the fall was we weren't going to hit those caps. And the reason we weren't going to hit those caps is because the rest of the world somehow got the message we weren't interested in attracting international students anymore.
We had nothing to do with that.
Yes, no. And so that is, I think, at this point, the real, the hangover of this is whatever the number's going to be, we can't be complacent in the belief that that will just automatically result in the best students from around the world coming to Canada. And just to illustrate, there were certainly some abuses in the Canadian system, but when you decide you're going to start being more selective in who you recruit, it really matters who you recruit. And instead, Canada has allowed the number of PhD students coming to fall by 1/5, and it's allowed the number of master's students to fall by 30%. Those are not the people we wanted to lose. And so it's really, really important that government be thoughtful about the way they decide these policies, and that they be doing it in discussion with the sector. Luke, can I just add one other thing on this?
Of course.
I would just say, going back to the conversation about the politics of advocating for universities, there is a kind of silver lining in the story about what's happened to international students. The spark for it was a housing crisis. The housing crisis was not a crisis in Canada until about 2 years ago. I don't mean there wasn't a problem, there was, but no one called it a political crisis. Canada's Prime Minister was saying 18 months ago, housing's not a federal responsibility. 6 months later, he was rewriting his immigration policy to deal with it. The point is, something that is a problem for people can crystallize and suddenly mobilize political action. And I think that there are some very strong similarities between what's happening in higher education right now and what was happening in the housing market. These are vehicles for opportunity, upward mobility. They're symbols of people's ambitions and what they want to do, what they hope for their families. And if those doors get closed, it can become a very potent political issue very quickly. So I think part of our challenge is to channel into that before we have to reach a disaster point.
Yeah, and we had the exact same challenge, albeit, a couple of months down the road. So there's a poor facsimile, I suspect, but, we calculated that only 4% of our private rental market was occupied by international students, that actual occupancy rates in areas of high university enrolments were double the average in Australia. So I think what we managed to do is take a sledgehammer, is what I've described, to our international student sector, whilst not addressing any of the underlying housing construction issues, nor did we curtail any of the other migration groups coming into the country. And I look at my friends around the room from New Zealand. We've let in apparently 400,000 or 500,000 New Zealanders, and given them an express ticket to citizenship, which is a great thing. But no one's touched that. And I'll leave people to ponder the politics of that, particularly for southeast Queensland. Vivienne, you've had the boom and bust, right? You've had come in, don't bring your family, you're all welcome again. How's it feel to see it play out in other countries, and what's the mood there?
It's nerve-wracking. I suppose the thing is now, I've been doing this in various roles for 25 years, and I now realise that it's an inevitable cycle that you never win. You have periods in which there's liberalisation and periods in which there is tightening up. That if we're smart, we aim for some kind of stable, what we should be aiming for is some kind of stability, which allows government to manage the pressures that they face politically in migration. And that, I suppose in a sense, my view slightly changed by the way that European politics has evolved in the last couple of years. But we look at what's happened in the US, in Australia, and what may be, brewing in Canada, in the sense that I think that, I imagine our politicians looking at the way that Reform, our quite right-wing, relatively new party led by Nigel Farage is leaping ahead in the polls. They look at the fact that the AfD in Germany came second in yesterday's election. They look at the way that, politicians have been unseated by migration as a political issue. And they, however liberal their instincts, I think there is a deep fear about what, losing the argument on migration means electorally. And I think if we don't understand that those pressures are quite real, we won't make any headway. But I mean, we've got this funny, we don't know whether we're blowing hot or cold, to be honest, at the moment. We've got half of government understands that the restrictions introduced by the outgoing Conservative government have precipitated an enormous financial problem in the university sector just because of the speed of the change, and would like to help us. They recognise that it's an economic opportunity for the UK. It's a massive export industry. It's widely distributed right across the country, et cetera, et cetera. And then you've got the Home Office and you've got Number 10 extraordinarily nervous about the consequences of being seen to be weak on immigration. And we're expecting an immigration white paper, which will be published in the next, I think, probably month or so. And honestly, I don't know whether we're going to see new restrictions. It's entirely possible. So we don't quite know where we stand, to be completely honest, with the government. But I certainly don't think there's going to be a reversal of some of the restrictions introduced by the outgoing Conservative government. And I think every time, Canadians and Australian politicians come up with bright ideas like caps, I just think, curses, don't tell our guys about that because we don't want any of that nonsense. But it has a certain sort of, it has a kind of certain beautiful simplicity to it, doesn't it? So I'm a bit worried about that, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm remembering the conversation we had about the Australian Universities Accord, right? And there was great optimism here a year ago when that paper was released, actually, on the 23rd of February last year. And one thing I did reflect on 6 months later was, if you were getting a new government and there was going to be an Accord-like review of your sector, is not to miss out on the essential debate that international students are fundamental to the architecture of the system, both in terms of funding, but outlook, and we miss that opportunity in Australia. And if you look at our Universities Accord, 407 pages, not a lot on international education, in fact, really relegated to a review of migration. And to me, the writing should have been on the wall to us, and I think we're a little optimistic about the potential growth and other exciting aspects of this giant, massive shopping list of reforms that we got handed to us. And it is something that I would say to my colleagues, if you are reviewing your education system that is internationalised, I think, Vivienne, you're at 24%, we're 25% international student overall. It is now so fundamental to the architecture of what we do, it needs to be enshrined in the design of it. And so that's something I reflect on. Andy, last year again, we sat on this stage when an IDP told us there was 35 million students across the world looking for an international education experience. A year before last, I was meeting with my friends from the German technology universities in my old job, and they were toying with the idea in the state of Bavaria of charging students for the first time in the German context because they'd seen what we do and they thought, hey, you've got nice stuff here that you can fund with alternative revenues. What is international education like in some other jurisdictions? Are there countries going to emerge as competitors for these, to feed this insatiable appetite for these 35 million plus students that want an international education experience?
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective because as we've talked around this, when you look at where international students want to go, it's predominantly English-speaking countries. So we as universities within English-speaking countries have this ability to attract large numbers of international students who are willing to pay the money to come and study in that environment, in the language. So we're very fortunate, each of us is fortunate. No matter how much we complain about what our governments are doing here, then we have an opportunity that our colleagues in non-English speaking countries do not have, simply because English has become the lingua franca, much to the chagrin of our colleagues in France, of course, and in Paris, and UNESCO, where the International Association of Universities is housed. We've seen that move away from a dual language where everything was in French and English to now operating almost entirely in English. So while we complain about what our governments are doing to us and limiting international students, it's worthwhile remembering that our colleagues who are running universities in non-English speaking countries simply do not have the same opportunities that we have to bring in this revenue. And although earlier I talked about how the governments in other countries are investing in their universities and pushing their universities to respond both to international students, perhaps by offering fee-free places, offering language courses, and so forth, there's another side to that, which is the government intervention and control in those universities. So while we're free to recruit international students, sometimes with a cap or increasingly with a cap, that is a freedom that universities in other countries don't have. But as we complain about the increasing regulation of our system by the government, we have to realize that there are many countries in the world where the government is much more invasive in the running of universities and has been for decades. So when you look at the autonomy, say, of UK universities, even within a European context, the UK universities have more autonomy than universities anywhere else in Europe. And so there is this balance. While we have freedom to recruit international students, we have also the autonomy then to run our universities, to select our staff, to pay our staff in ways which universities in other countries don't have. To your point that while the Germans were looking at perhaps introducing fees, as fees are introduced in some of these non-English speaking countries, they see the number of international students that they're recruiting reduce from low levels to extremely low levels. So it's something where countries do want to attract more international students, they have to start teaching classes in English. That then doesn't necessarily have social license within the country that they're operating in. So I think that we should count our blessings as well as complaining about what the government's doing to us. But just remember that in many aspects, we are much freer from a university autonomy perspective than colleagues in non-Western democracies.
Yeah, it's a great point. Gabriel, we talked about phenomenal political disruptions. I'm going to draw your attention to south of the border again one more time. During the presidential election campaign, Donald Trump surprised us when he said we should be giving green cards to students who undertake high-value, predominantly tech and other related courses in American universities. Was that a surprise to you, given the kind of migration rhetoric from Trump, and will that materialise? And what can we think about this kind of random, I guess, approach to migration priorities and sector priorities, and just erratic policy, for that matter, from our friends in the US?
I mean, my capacity to be surprised by Mr. Trump has been so eroded. I'm not sure. It caught my attention.
Yeah.
I think it reflects, in part, the mix of interests and agendas that are surrounding him. Certainly, the tech industry, I think, is quite concerned about losing the American advantage in talent. I have to tell you, I see no indication that the administration's approach is helping it to be more competitive and attracting the world's most talented young minds. And in fact, we run a small committee that is dedicated, in fact, my colleague Julia Scott is here, and she's in charge of it, which is dedicated to helping young Canadian researchers basically build their CVs to be considered for international prizes. And so that we have some folks on this who are pretty well connected to the international research ecosystem. And when we talked to them the other day, they said they've never gotten so many phone calls from top flight researchers in the United States or in other parts of the world from people who would normally be considering going to the States, saying, I'm interested in opportunities in Canada. And so we'll see. Obviously, there's a certain type of person, maybe those who are more focused on the entrepreneurial opportunities in the United States who might continue to be drawn there. But I think all indications are their approach is toxic to people who are interested in learning.
Yeah. We're going to run out of time, and I know we could talk for many, many, many more hours as a group. One thing we're all very concerned about is what's happening with social cohesion in our communities. Conflict around the world is manifesting in protest and unrest. We've seen that on our campuses with encampments, government's responses to that, our own responses as institutions. Vivienne, this is something I had a long discussion with some of your team about when I was in the UK, about the Australian response to ensuring our universities remain beacons of freedom of academic expression and thought, but also places that don't encourage hate speech. How's that manifesting and developing in the UK context at the moment?
Well, I think the parallels between what's been happening in many of our systems are quite strong. I think that this autumn, when universities when students came back to campus, we were all a bit braced for a re-emergence of the encampment movement, of further protest, and maybe the weather helped. It's just miserable camping out in the UK in December and January, so you'd have to be pretty hard-boiled to want to do that. But it has been much quieter. We have had a few incidents which have been very difficult for universities to manage. I think a huge amount has been learned by university leaders across the system in the UK, and I think elsewhere across in the last year, about how you manage these duties, because we have a legal obligation to protect and promote free speech, to facilitate protest, and we also have similarly robust legal responsibilities around preventing hate speech, radicalisation, incitement to violence, and all of the legislation around harassment and inequalities, and navigating that has been enormously complicated. I don't know whether part of me thinks that we were all caught in this. The predominant rhetoric 2 years ago would have been about universities suppressing free speech. There is still a really kind of elevated level of concern about universities' ability to safeguard free speech. In one respect, what's happened since October the 7th and the extraordinary experience on university campuses is at least been to illustrate for a wider audience that this is not a simple matter by any stretch of the imagination. And I think to some extent that has been productive. It's illustrated that you may very much want a certain sort of speech to be protected and feel very, very strongly that a different sort of speech should be prevented. And that those people who have a simplistic attitude or a view that that is a simple process to manage, maybe have learned a little bit by watching the last sort of couple of years play out.
Yeah, thank you. And Gabriel, in Canada, I know this is something we've talked about a lot in our forums. How's it manifesting now on campus and through the political discussions related to it?
I mean, I think the trajectory of it is very much as we just heard about in the UK, which was, an incredibly intense period right up until the summer, where, last spring and into the summer, where we had encampments on, I don't know, a dozen or more universities across the country, including quite a large one at our biggest university in the center of Toronto, and another in downtown Montreal. So places where they were very visible. And we have not seen them return. Canada is probably as bad a place to spend your time camping out as the UK. So it isn't a glamorous thing to have to spend your time doing. I'll tell you the observation I made as a new person in my job, and I think something that is worth thinking about, is how hard it was for universities to effectively talk about what was happening on campus.
Yeah.
And in Canada, part of that, and I would assume the same is true otherwise, partly because every campus and every community needed some space to be able to deal with the situation in the way that made the most sense. So it was kind of difficult as a sector to say this is our approach. But the other thing, and I hope we can be reflective about this, is these issues are so sensitive inside the university and outside the university that the leadership of the university can find themselves in a situation where they feel like, I need to be communicating to the community the principles that are guiding us, but I feel like anything I say is either going to set off landmines in the community or inside the institution. And I think we have some work to do there, because we have to be able to articulate to some degree the principles that animate our institutions so that people can have something to balance the criticisms, because it was relentless. It was just a hammering against the university for months. And there'll always be criticism around universities, as folks in here know better than me, but there has to be the ability to at least help people understand values that are informing decisions they may not fully agree with.
We've run out of time, but I'll let you make some final remarks, Andrew. I've often said a healthy democracy has healthy universities. Is that the case around the world? Healthy democracies have healthy universities?
Well, I think it all comes down to definition, and the Vice-Chancellor's had a significant discussion yesterday around definition of anti-Semitism, but I think many things, it's what's a healthy university, what's a healthy democracy. It's worth bearing in mind as we go through these struggles with social cohesion on our campus, what some of our other colleagues are going through in other countries. Clearly, in Gaza, universities have simply been leveled, and students are no longer able to complete their studies. In Afghanistan, then women are no longer able to complete their studies at university or indeed in any institution. Our colleagues that border with Russia are living in fear that they will be the next Ukraine. Our Ukrainian colleagues, obviously similarly, many of their universities are now rubble. In many countries then, the desperation of the students is not so much with international politics, but with internal politics. And we have occasions where members have students rioting on campus and burning down university buildings. So while we struggle with these issues, which are ones that we need to take very seriously, I think we also need to bear in mind the broader context and look at what colleagues running universities in other countries are experiencing and have to deal with, and be thinking about what we can do to assist them. So while we have our misfortunes, when we look across at what others are dealing with, I think it puts them in perspective.
And what a lovely way to finish. Thank you. I've got to get you all down to the main plenary, but can you join me in thanking Vivienne, Gabriel and Andy? Thank you very much.